welcome to Sociology 1. So we're continuing on with functionalism, and to understand functionalism, we're focusing on the questions of deviance and conformity, and within that framework, we're focusing now on theories of crime, and we started with strain theory, a functionalist theory of crime, one of the main ones from functionalism. But we pointed out some limitations of that theory, and we got into symbolic interactionism, which sees crime not so much as something that a person, what we focused on was the ways that you can't always know who the criminals are or not because society labels people just differently. We talked about unequal labeling, how the powerless people in society are more likely to be labeled as criminals and deviant than the powerful people in a society. And we went further and said, well, when you do get labeled, it might make you actually more likely to become somebody who doesn't want to follow or isn't able to follow the rules and laws of your society. So we talked about primary deviation leading to secondary deviation in terms of the labeling process. And we talked about it being like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's almost like society says to certain people, you're not one of the mainstream, you're bad, you're different, you're going to cause trouble, and then they do. And so maybe we should find ways to integrate people more into the group and define the group in a large enough, broad enough way that people feel connected to it and want to obey its rules. But there's another way that people begin to, the way symbolic interactionism looks at crime. It's basically here focusing on interaction. It's through people interacting that some get labeled and some don't, and it's through the interactions of people that some people end up on a path of deviance and crime and others not. One type of symbolic interactionism is something called learning theory. And it's the idea that crime is a learned behavior. It's not something that you're born being. Again, there have been some biological efforts to try and find genes that cause people to be criminals, but most of those biological theories have been discredited. And even sociology sometimes tries to figure out what's in your background or something, like what's missing from your background. Like, is it your income or your race or your parenting or something wrong with how you were brought up that made you a criminal, something missing. And learning theory says, no, it's not so much something missing that makes you a criminal. It's something present in your life that taught you how to be a criminal. And the point here is that, crime's a behavior. And so the basic idea of this theory is that crime, like conformity, or you could say deviance, like conformity, is learned. You don't come out of the womb knowing how to obey the rules of your society. I can tell you this, I have a 6-week-old at home. I also have a 3-year-old at home. Neither one of them knows what he's doing as far as fitting into society, and every day, every second, they're breaking the norms of society. Pulling down their pants when they shouldn't, yelling when they shouldn't, throwing up all over people when they shouldn't. I mean, these are things children need to be taught how to control these behaviors and fit into normal our society's definition of normal social life. So if you have to be taught how to conform, it stands to reason, it's logical to assume that you have to learn how to be a criminal as well. And I don't know how to sell crack. I kind of wish I did. It might pay more than being a professor. But I don't know how to turn cocaine into smokable crack. I don't know how to fire a semi-automatic weapon. I don't know how to evade the police. I don't know where to buy a lot of wholesale cocaine and then sell it retail. There's a whole bunch of skills involved in being a drug dealer. I don't know how to steal a car. I wish I knew how to hotwire a car, because sometimes I forget and leave my keys inside my car and I have to call the police. But if I knew how to break into my own car and hotwire it, boy, that'd be nice. But somebody had to teach people. If young kids get involved in the crime trade, in drug trade, in car thefts, rings, in other kinds of criminal behavior, they didn't just decide, hey, I want to be a criminal. And so learning theory says people learn it somehow. We all, part of this theory, not a tangent, but a basic point in this theory, is that we all learn positive and negative things, messages about crime. We're all growing up and we hear things like crime doesn't pay, McRuff the crime dog says, take a bite out of crime. I mean, we all see shows and hear about crime being a bad thing and that criminals end up bad and have unhappy. But we also hear things that tell us, hey, maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to be a criminal. Like, hey, it looks like they're having fun. Oh, I love that gangster film where the gangster is, looks cool. So we're all getting positive and negative messages, and this theory says if some people turn to a life of crime, they must have somehow gotten more positive messages about crime than negative messages. And you could see how that might happen. When I grew up in my neighborhood, I remember one time asking my mom, why is that guy drinking out of a paper bag? What kind of liquid can stay in a paper bag, Mom? It's like, it's not a paper bag. I'm like, what's in there? She's like, wine. He's a wino. I'm like, well, why is he sitting on a bench, in the middle of the day drinking wine? And she's like, well, he's addicted to alcohol and, he needs to do that. And, and I'm like, well, how does that happen to somebody? Well, maybe he had a really hard life and didn't go to school and didn't get a good job, or, he's an unhappy person and alcohol probably made him feel better. But, he's probably not happy being an alcoholic. Anyway, she taught me that. And then I remember also seeing these houses that were really nice, much nicer than ours, with much nicer cars out in front. And I'm like, well, what are those houses? How do you get to live in one of those? Where do you get those kind of cars? She said, well, that guy's a lawyer, that guy's a doctor, they make a lot of money. You better be ready to go to a lot of school, son, if you want to make that, Your daddy went to school, but they went to even more school, your daddy just has a PhD, not a law degree. Anyway, actually law is less school. But anyway, but the lesson was clear to me. If you want a happy life with nice things, you work hard, you go to school. If you want to end up unhappy on a park bench drinking out of a paper bag, don't go to school. On the other hand, if you grow up around here in Linda, California, you might get the opposite message. You might see people with jobs like, people working at Walmart or trash collectors and say to yourself, well, if I work real hard, I get to be a trash collector. And then you might see other people who have really nice cars and, scantily clad women around them, and you might say, well, how do you get to be one of those? And, well, those are the drug dealers. And so you may, conclude an opposite thing growing up around here. So the point is that people learn crime by the messages they get from society. But that's a little vague because, as we've already pointed out, most people, even in an area like Linda, don't learn to become criminals and don't conclude from growing up in this area that it's better to go be a criminal than to go be a conforming person. So there must be something more present than just messages. And one version of this theory, of learning theory, is known as Differential Association theory. It starts from that same idea. You must learn how to be a criminal. You don't automatically know how to steal cars or sell drugs. But it can't just be a passive kind of learning where you're just looking around and going, yeah, I want to be that. Because you might look at the criminals and think you want to be one. That didn't turn you into one. Somehow you have to become one. And this theory says what differentiates, the reason it's called differential, is it's trying to differentiate. If all these kids growing up in an area like Linda around here have the potential to become criminals, but only a small number do, what differentiates that small number from the rest of the people? And the theory basically says it's whom they associate with. It's who you come in contact with. In this case, it's basically saying, and the way they put it is, there is a criminalistic exposure to a criminalistic tradition. That's a fancy scientific way of saying there's already criminals in the neighborhood. And some kids get exposed to them and get recruited by them and get turned into criminals by the adult criminals that are already present in the neighborhood. So it's really just talking about recruitment by established criminals. We were talking earlier about labeling theory and how at one point in our society we decided we shouldn't throw young people into jail with older people because that might actually make them worse criminals. And so we ought to be careful about punishing children. And we used to have this juvenile court system that said when kids do wrong, let's take them away from society, but not put them in with the adult criminals and try to get them on the right path. The juvenile court, I think I talked about it. Maybe I didn't. Did I not? The juvenile court was started in 1899, and the idea was we don't want to label people. When they're young, we want them off the streets. We don't want them out there, but we don't want them, if they do commit wrong, we don't want them to be saddled for life with this label of being a criminal. And so the juvenile court was set up in a different way, and you're not called a court. I mean, there's a hearing that you have, but it's like a petition. You're petitioned to the court. You're not charged with the crime. And you don't get sentenced, you get a disposition. There's a whole different terminology for the juvenile court. And the reason is because of, before there even was labeling theory, people suspected that this might be the case. In recent years, though, we've kind of gone away from the juvenile court. More and more we're just declaring juveniles, even if they're under 18, just declaring them an adult and saying we're going to try you as an adult and charge you as an adult and do all the same things as if you were an adult. They might not put you in adult prison at the end of the thing, but they're still treating it as a criminal case, not as just a wayward youth that needs help. This juvenile court was set up by the child savers. Their idea was that kids who are committing wrong, they must have learned it from somewhere. Somebody taught them to be doing bad stuff, and so we as a society shouldn't hold them criminally accountable for their actions. We should say, hey, you've been steered wrong by society in some way, and we're going to get you on the right path. And so it was about saving children from bad adults was the idea. They've been taught how to be criminals. Let's get them back around good adults that'll teach them the good ways to do things. But like I said, we're getting away from the juvenile court system, and we're going more to an idea that if a child is a criminal, he's a criminal and needs to be punished. And ironically, one problem with the juvenile court was it did in some ways make children vulnerable to being preyed upon by adult criminals. Because if you can do less time and get less punishment for your crime, then an adult criminal might say to himself, well, I need some people to run drugs around the city for me. If I get an adult, somebody over 18 to do it, I'm going to have to pay that person thousands of dollars because it's a big risk because they're going to go away for jail for a long time. If it's a kid who's only going to go to juvenile hall, until he's 18 or whatever, 25 at the most, then maybe I don't have to pay him as much to do the job. And kids will willingly become drug dealers because they know their consequences aren't that high. So that's what kind of happened is a lot of criminals began preying on juveniles and getting them involved in drug dealing and other kinds of criminal activity. And then it looked like our juvenile court was a stupid thing because it was making kids be vulnerable to crime. But the way we responded as a society was say, well, let's crack down on the kids and make it tougher for them. And we've kind of done that. We've had zero tolerance policies now where kids get long sentences for things that in the old days they would have gotten a second chance for and gotten a chance to turn their lives around. And it's more like we're just throwing away the key without worrying about labeling theory, without worrying about who's been recruited by adults into what, just saying, well, you did bad and you're getting punished for it. Sociology, like I'm saying, would say, let's be very careful before we do things like that. The juvenile court had some problems, but it was also, generally speaking, a smart thing to treat juveniles as different than adults, especially when it comes to deviant behavior. And especially we'd have to worry about, are we really making our society safer by punishing people? That might be the logical fallacy there, is we think if we punish them, then they'll stop doing the bad behavior and we'll all be safe. And the actual reality oftentimes is by punishing them, you make it worse, not better. Or you got to find a way to correct the behavior, not just punish it. And we used to call it corrections. We used to call it the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, and more we're just calling it prisons and discipline. But anyway, so the theory of differential association says kids learn from older criminals how to be involved, and that's what really differentiates. If you look at a neighborhood like Linda, some kids are involved in the drug trade, young people, and get heavily involved in it. But it's probably accurate to say they didn't just decide that one day to be a drug dealer. They got involved with and associated with people who were doing that, and they learned it. And so when your mom says, don't fall in with the wrong crowd, It's sort of an old truism of moms is to say, don't hang around bad people, because if you do, you may end up one of them, and that's essentially what that theory says, the theory of differential association. What about conflict theory? We've looked at some functionalism, some symbolic interactionism. What do conflict theorists have to say about crime? And really, they ask a different question. They don't start from the same base as these other theories. Other theories have been asking all along here, why do some people commit crime and others don't? And trying to figure out what are the factors or variables that push kids into crime. Is it their neighborhood? Is it the norms and the strain between what you can do and how you're supposed to do it? Is it being exposed to other criminals? What is it that makes people criminals? And conflict theory says, I don't care about that question. Conflict theorists aren't that concerned about why people become criminals, because conflict theory starts from the fact that crime and punishment reflect deeper social inequalities in our society. So they start from this fact that we have big class inequality in our society. We have haves and have-nots. And from a conflict theory standpoint, the haves use the law and the law enforcement system to maintain their power and dominance. And the people without property and power are controlled by the laws and the courts and the jails. And so it's not really a question of why do some people commit crime, because a conflict theorist assumes people who aren't in power and don't have access to, the means of survival are going to be willing to break the laws of the people in power who do have access to survival. So it's not really that hard of a question to understand why would people break the law from a conflict theory standpoint. From a conflict theory standpoint, the question really that's more interesting is, well, who makes the laws? Why are they making them? How are they using the laws and the courts and the law enforcement system to maintain their power over others? And so it's really a whole different question. They basically says laws and law enforcement enhance the power of the powerful, or let's say maintain the power of dominant groups. So conflict theories say, not really a question who breaks the law or why do they do it. What we should really focus on are how the laws are unequal to begin with. According to conflict theorists, the laws themselves are designed to keep poor people powerless and under the control of wealthier people. Can you think of any examples like that? I mean, that's a pretty radical statement, because according to our dominant ideology of our society, our laws are all equal. Our justice system is equal. It's Lady Justice. She has the scales of justice, and they're equal, and it doesn't matter who's rich or who's poor. It's all equal, right? Well, not according to conflict theory. Can you think of any examples of laws that would seem to favor the powerful and the property owners, but that don't necessarily favor those without property and power? Is that a hand up, John?
Some of them have lower gains tax.
Okay, so how we pay taxes, and that's in the news right now. I don't know if you saw, finally we got a little glimpse, or the New York Times did, into Donald Trump's taxes, and turns out he lost $900 million in 1995. And according to our tax law, if you lose that much money on the stock market, I guess, I don't know the full details, then you're allowed to write off those taxes later. Like you could say, well, I lost all that money, so I don't owe taxes. So he hasn't paid taxes since 1995 because he lost $1 billion. So that'd be nice if I could go to a casino and lose, $100,000 and then say, sorry, I'm not paying taxes for the next 20 years because I already lost $100,000. That's basically what the law says. If you're a rich man that lost your money investing it, then you don't owe the government anything. Anyway, but our tax laws in general say if you invest money and you make your money off investing, you pay a capital gains tax, you pay 15% of your gains. If you make your money by working for a living, like we all do in here, I assume, you pay more like 30% or more of your money in taxes. So just the tax law favors those with wealth and power who make their money off investments and comes down harder on people who work for a living. So that would be one example. Any other examples you can think of? How the laws favor the powerful?
An example you already gave was the private schools, how they have special security forces that are more reasonable.
Okay, well, so if you can afford them and you can afford to send your kids to private school, you can send them to a place. That really goes down to more how law enforcement is unequal, because the laws as written could still be equal, and you could say, well, the people at a rich school, if they break the cocaine laws, then they're going to be just as accountable as the people at the public schools who break the cocaine laws. And officially, our society would say we would hold either student accountable for using cocaine in our society. But the cocaine laws might appear to be equitable, but actually they're not. Or they haven't been until recently. Did I already talk about crack versus powder? Did I already talk about that one? That's another one. But a better one maybe, or the classic one that's often used, is the law that says no sleeping under bridges. That sounds equal. It sounds like none of us are allowed to do that. It's not legal to sleep under a bridge. But really, who's that law really aimed at? Poor people. I mean, if you're wealthy and you own a house, you're not thinking about sleeping under a bridge. The only person that would sleep under a bridge is someone who didn't have a house to live in. So really, it's like, that was a classic example from the French Revolution. The French people that wanted to overthrow the king and the wealthy of France said, well, these are the kind of laws you have. You make one set of laws for us and another for you guys. But in our own community right here, they have no camping laws. It says you're not allowed to camp in the city of Marysville. What do they mean by that? They mean I'm not allowed to go get my RV and go have s'mores in Ellis Lake? Is that what they're talking about? Is that the kind of camping they mean?
Like homeless people.
They mean homeless people. You're not allowed to go to sleep on a park bench. You're not allowed to sleep in your car on a city street. So really it's saying if you're homeless, if you're a person that can't afford to rent an apartment and can't afford to buy a house, then you're not allowed in the city of Marysville, basically. We can arrest you for being here. And so it's essentially a law that protects those with property and places to stay against those who don't have that. You could also say the no loitering laws. Laws that say you're not allowed to hang out in the mall. What does loitering mean? I always used to wonder that as a kid. What's loitering, Mom? Well, loitering means hanging out. Well, what's wrong with hanging out? Well, if you're hanging out and you're not spending money, then the business owners get mad. If you own a mall, if you have a business at a mall, then you don't want teenagers hanging out there not spending money. You're worried it's going to scare away the people that do have the money. So laws that say you're not allowed to loiter are basically saying if you're somebody who's not shopping, if you don't have business to do down here, then you're not welcome. And again, it's basically saying Chico has a lot of these issues. You have a lot of young homeless people that are apparently hanging out. They don't work, they're not spending money, and the city uses laws to roust people, lock them up, fine them, kick them out of town, and you can say that's an example of, or the conflict theorists would say, that's an example of the people with property and wealth using the law to maintain their property. Well, just the very idea of no trespassing. You see those signs all the time, everywhere, and what that's basically saying is, if you don't own property, you can't go wherever you want. And it's also saying if you do own property, then you have the whole police force to call on. Anytime you think somebody's on your property and they're not supposed to be there, you can just call the cops and they'll be your own personal security force. On the other hand, if you don't own property, you never get to call the cops to say, hey, this guy's making me uncomfortable. Like if you lived in an apartment building and you saw some guy wandering around the apartment grounds and you called the cops and said, there's a guy in the apartment grounds, the cop would say, do you own the apartment building? And you say, no, I'm renting here. And they'd say, well, then we can't help you. If the owner of the building wants to call and complain about a stranger, then we'll do something about it. So if you are just living there, then you don't have the right to say, this person's creeping me out and I'm worried about this person. But if you're the owner, you could say that. So again, property owners have a lot more power in our system than non-property owners. And a conflict theorist who studies capitalism and property owners, private property as the key to capitalism, would say, well, that totally makes sense that in a capitalist society, the law itself benefits those with property and is aimed at those without it. What about law enforcement? Law enforcement is unequal is another claim of conflict theory. A lot of people making that claim in America today, not just based on class, but based on race. And in America, class and race are very much connected to each other. So when people say the cops don't treat brown people equally, they're also basically saying cops don't treat poor people equally. You don't see too many wealthy non-white people being shot in the street. So it isn't just a race issue, a conflict theorist would say. It's really more of a class issue. And so, yes, poor people for a long time have been more likely to be roughly handled by the police in one way or another, regardless of their race. So law enforcement is unequal. A good example, I would say, is the private property laws are one reason why law enforcement's unequal. They can't patrol things equally. It's much harder to patrol what the rich people are doing behind closed private property doors and fences than it is to patrol poor people. And so it just turns out that who gets arrested for things, like who gets arrested for smoking pot, who gets arrested for using cocaine, who gets arrested for domestic violence, it's much more likely to be people without power and wealth than people with it. And we're going to talk more about domestic violence at another point in this class. But there's reasons why we suspect that rich people may be just as likely to do it. They're just much less likely to be caught for it. Anyway, so law enforcement's unequal. And a good example I would use is if you go to Los Angeles, where I used to live, you'll see at night LAPD helicopters. And you'll see the LAPD helicopters over certain areas of LA all the time. You'll see them hovering over East LA. You'll see them hovering over South Central LA. You're not going to see them hovering over West LA too much. And if you went to the cops and you said to the LAPD and said, what's the matter, LAPD? Are you racist? I think people have asked that before of them. But anyway, if you ask the LAPD, are you racist? Why do you only patrol those areas? Because South Central LA, that's where a lot of black people live. East LA, that's where a lot of Latino people live. West LA, that's where a lot of white people live. So why aren't you guys ever hovering over there? Why are you hovering over our neighborhoods? And what would the LAPD say? Would they say, well, it's because we're a bunch of racists. That's why. We just want to arrest the children of brown people. That's why. Would they say that? No. They would say, what would they say?
They're distributing resources based on crime.
They would say that's where the crime is. We're not going to go hover over Beverly Hills if there's not a lot of crime going on over there. We're going to go hover over South Central LA. So they say, well, we're just where the high crime area is. That's where we need to place our resources, place our helicopters. Okay, well, a conflict theorist then asks, well, why are some areas high crime areas? How does that happen? And who decided that? You can point to things, and this actually goes back to the law things, but there are things called zoning laws. Zoning laws determine where things get put in a city. For example, there's a whole set of laws referred to as vice ordinances or vice zones. A vice zone, vice refers to things that aren't illegal, but they're not very nice for families to pay attention to. Can you think of something that might be something you don't want your children to see, but it's not illegal? Huh?
Strip clubs?
Strip clubs, good example. Casinos, bars, pool halls, these kinds of things. Adult stores. Vice zones are parts of a city where it's legal to have those things. And other parts of the city, the law says you can't put those things here. And cities have places that are just residential, just for houses, things that are commercial, things that are light industrial, agricultural. You have different zones. And one type of zone is a vice zone. So certain areas of cities, if you look at them, are where all the strip clubs are, and the casinos, and the bars, and the liquor stores, and where do those places tend to be? Poorer neighborhoods, because poor people don't have as much power. If you are a city and somebody wants to put in a casino and a lot of residents want a casino, well then the question becomes, where are we going to put that casino? And you usually don't put it in the neighborhood with all the nice houses. For one thing, casino is going to bring down the property values. So the rich people with their nice houses are going to say, don't put that here. You're going to bring down our values. So where can we put it? Well, put it somewhere where people won't object and say, don't put that here. Well, where would that be? In the areas where there's poor people, because they have too much else going on in their lives to worry about what's happening at City Hall and what's happening in the zoning department of the city. And so, for example, right around here, there's a strip club in Marysville. Where is it? Right over here on, oh, he knows where it is. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's right over here in Linda, right on Hampton-Smartville Road and Linda Road, one of the poorest parts of Marysville. They're about to put in a casino in Marysville. Where are they putting that? In Oliver's, in this part of the town. They're not putting things over in, I mean, you can really think of this community as Yuba Sutter, so it includes Yuba City, and they're not putting a lot of strip clubs over in Yuba City and casinos over there, but over here, more of that. And so again, if poor people don't object, if they're not politically involved, if they don't know the mayor and all that stuff, then the decisions get made that the people with power and influence, they influence those decisions to fit their lives. So they're not going to put things in their neighborhoods that their kids are going to have to deal with. They'll put it in the neighborhoods that don't have power. So it happens that cities have deviant neighborhoods where there's always been a high crime rate. East LA is one of those areas, but East LA used to not be Latino, it used to be Jewish. Poor Jewish people first moved there. Those Jewish people made money and moved out. Now a lot of them live in West LA, but the area now is poor immigrants that are from somewhere else, from Mexico and other parts of South America and Central America. And those are new immigrants, newer poor immigrants, and that's where the crime still is. That's where the casinos and strip clubs and, Hustler Casino is a good example. It's a casino owned by Hustler Magazine, which is an old strip magazine, and it was, over there in Compton. And so a lot of these things get put where poorer kids grow up. And then through the theory of differential association, you could see how if poor kids are growing up around casinos and strip clubs and the kinds of things that are owned by organized criminals and stuff, well, it stands to reason that those poorer, darker children end up more likely to get involved with that kind of stuff. So anyway, so law enforcement might not be trying to be racist or classist, but when they just pursue crime, they're following what people with power have already decided about where to put things. And so certain cities have certain pockets that are always high crime areas, no matter who lives there. And then the courts are unequal. And that one, I don't think I have to spend much time at all trying to persuade you that if you have money and power, you can get a lot better treatment in our courts than you can if you don't have money and power. Just on the face of it, just according to the rules of the court. For one thing, if you don't have a lawyer, one will be appointed for you. Well, what does that mean? If you have a lawyer, you're probably paying well to have one. So people who can pay well for a lawyer get those kind. If you can't afford one, you get an appointed lawyer, and public defenders are, by definition, not as able to defend you as a private lawyer. Why? They have large caseloads. They have a bunch of people they got to defend. They don't have a big budget. They don't have a bunch of money in the bank to help fight your case, so they can't hire investigators and other people and do their own, interviewing a bunch of possible witnesses. If you've got the dream team, though, if you've got 5 lawyers fighting for you and they've got all these private investigators and they can go out and find some reasonable doubt, like if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit, then maybe you get off like OJ does. But there again, I'm emphasizing as a conflict theorist would, it's not about race, really, it's about class. It's about if you've got the money in America, you can kind of, in many ways, buy better justice than you can if you don't have the money. So all of that is what conflict theorists focus on when they're looking at crime and deviance. And their basic argument would be if things are more equal in society, if people have what they need and aren't unjustly deprived of the things they need, then crime would probably go down because people are willing to violate rules that they don't think really are for them, but are against them. And if people perceive the cops and the courts and the laws as stacked against them, then they're not going to respect those laws and they're going to willingly break them. But that reflects the deeper inequalities in our society and people feeling unjustly shut out of resources. There's another kind of theory that your textbook mentions, and I don't know if it really fits in functionalism or symbolic interactionism or conflict theory. It's kind of its own theory. And it's kind of its own theory mainly because, again, it asks a different question, really, than the other theories are asking. It has a point of departure, let's call it that, meaning these other theories are all kind of asking about who commits crime and why, or the conflict theory asks, who makes the laws and why. But control theory starts with the question, what causes conformity? What causes most people, most of the time, to not be criminals and serious deviants? Because the fact of the matter is, most people are conformists. Even in a city, even in a place like Linda, which has every reason around it to make little kids grow up here and want to be deviant criminals. Even in a place like this, most people are not. Most people follow the rules. Most people do what's expected of them in the society, most of the time. So that might be a more interesting question. Instead of trying to figure out why that small group of people, that small under 5%, tiny percentage of the population gets heavily involved in crime, instead of trying to figure out what makes them tick, what causes crime, let's look at the other 95% and ask, what's causing them not to commit crime? What's causing them to be, most of the time, people who follow the rules? And if you can answer this question, what causes conformity, then maybe you'll even understand crime better, because maybe it's something people lack, really. Again, we're back to that idea that they're missing something, these criminals. What are they missing? Control theory starts from the idea that all of us could be criminals, really. What really separates the criminal from the non-criminal is self-control, because all of us have little urges, like a butt we want to pinch, or an item we want to take from the store, or something we shouldn't do. And we have urges to do that, but most of us, most of the time, control our urges and don't go do those things. So it's really, according to this theory, about control, self-control, but where does that self-control come from? And one version of control theory is called social bond theory. And this theory basically says if you're bonded to your society, if you feel tightly connected to it, then you're not going to really want to go against it. You're not going to want to violate its rules or disrespect it. And so that's ultimately what leads to the self-control, is feeling bonded to the society. So what's the bond? And this theory says there's 4 elements of the social bond. And if a young person has all of these elements in place, then that young person's going to feel bonded and not really want, or be less likely to want to violate the society. On the other hand, if any element of that bond is weak or not present, then the bond itself might not really be strong, and therefore the child might be free in their mind or heart to go and do bad stuff. And when I say child, I mean young person up to like the age of 25. What are these elements? One is attachment. And that's the idea that you're attached to a conventional adult, to a law-abiding adult. At least one. The theory simply says there has to be at least one adult in the child's life that person looks up to and says, hey, that person's a law-abiding person. That person follows the rules. And I might not want to violate the rules, because if I'm a non-law-abiding person, then maybe my connection, my bond, my attachment with this person will go away. Now, obviously, your parent or parents would be a perfect person to be attached to. And for most of us, that's probably the primary person we're attached to, our mom and or dad. But it could also be somebody else. This theory says it doesn't have to be a blood relative. It could just be your mom. It could just be your dad, but it doesn't have to be both parents. It doesn't even have to be a parent. It could be a teacher. It could be a coach. It could be a priest. It could be a local cop. It could be an older cousin or uncle. It just has to be somebody who's an adult who this kid respects and looks up to and wants to be like, because they respect them and feel connected to them. But young people that don't have that, any adult in their life that they're really connected to, this theory says they're missing that element of the bond, attachment. The second element is involvement. And this means involvement in pro-social activities. Crime is often described as an antisocial activity, and it is antisocial. It's the definition of antisocial because society creates these norms, these rules, and if you're going against them, you're going against society. Pro-social activities, though, would be those activities that aren't harming society in some way or violating its rules and ideas. So obviously school would be one of the main things a person could be involved in, that if you're spending your days going to school, you're not spending your days out in the streets causing trouble. But what about after school? And by the way, if you look at the FBI's data on youth crime, do you know what time of day is the peak hours for youth to be involved in crime? It's the after-school hours, 3 to 5 in the afternoon is when a lot of youth crime happens. And so it's funny, a few years ago they were trying to do these youth curfews at night, 10 o'clock youth curfews, and a lot of sociologists and criminologists are like, we're saying, that's not the time of day when youth crime peaks. Why would you put them at home at night? They already are at home. It's the daytime hours that we need to worry about. So what about after school? Well, pro-social activities like sports, like a job, like church, like theater. I mean, something you're doing after school that isn't running around with your homies is probably a more pro-social thing to be doing. And this, again, sounds like something your mom might have told you. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, idle hands are the devil's workshop. Have you ever heard that phrase? Nobody says that anymore? That's why America's not great anymore. No, sorry. What they used to say, idle hands are the devil's workshop, meaning if you're bored, if you're not doing anything, if you're idle, that's the time when the devil might, evil might, lurk into your mind as something fun to do. And I can speak to this. When I was a kid in junior high coming home with my buddy and we didn't have anything to do or any adults around, and we thought a really good idea would be to go to the top of the hill and throw dirt clods as cars as they were going by. And it wasn't a good idea. We got caught and severely handled. But anyway, when you're bored, that's when stupid stuff sounds like a good idea sometimes. And so not being bored, being involved in pro-social things after school is part of being bonded to your society. Third one is commitment. And this refers to commitment to a future goal. This idea is all about delayed gratification. You sometimes hear adults talk about this, that children who just want instant gratification, who just want pleasure right now, I want to have fun right now. And a lot of adults say, including the adults who wrote this theory, that when kids are committed to a future goal, in this case like a job, like you want to become a doctor one day. If you have a goal like I want to become a doctor one day, then you're more likely to say to yourself, well, something comes my way that sounds fun, like my friends call me up and say, hey, let's go throw dirt clods at cars. And you're like, well, that sounds fun, but I want to be a doctor when I grow up, and I have a test tomorrow in my math class. If I fail my math class test, then I might not get into Stanford, and if I don't get into Stanford, I'm not going to get into the best medical school, and my whole dream of being a doctor is going to go down the drain. So if you have that future goal, that's a strong reason to stay on your path and not be tempted by little momentary pleasures. And so it's really about delayed gratification, about putting off your pleasure until later and saying, well, one day I'll be a doctor, and that's going to be a lot more fun than throwing dirt clods. But if you have no future goal, if you're just living YOLO, as they say, if every day is a day for fun, then, why not just go throw dirt clods at cars, or why not just go inject some cocaine into my veins too, and then throw dirt clods? That'll be really fun. And then fourth, though, is belief. Do you believe that society is really going to pay off in the rewards that it promises when it says, control yourself, delay your gratification, commit yourself to a future goal? In other words, do you have belief in society's rewards, in its promises? And a lot of kids grow up in America and lose faith that America and society is really going to reward them later. They may see older brothers or cousins who did everything right, who went to school and put their nose to the grindstone and try hard and still ended up with a crappy job or no job. They might see people who had jobs and worked really hard, like the Newman family and Stanley family, and then find themselves through no fault of their own much worse off than they used to be. And so kids can sometimes grow up in a world like that and say, you know what, I'm being played for a sucker. It'd be a sucker who sits there and goes to school and try hard. I'll delay my gratification. I'll die before I ever get gratified. Why don't I gratify now? And so you really have to believe in all this stuff for it to really be a bond that's going to keep you in check. But that's the basic idea, is that if people are bonded in this way, they're not going to want to go do those things that might violate society, because violating society is going to violate your bond. And if you really have that bond, you're going to want to maintain it and not lose the respect of this adult, or get kicked out of the things you enjoy doing, or get knocked off your path towards your future goal, or be deprived of your rewards. And so that's the basic theory. And you can see how, maybe you can see, the next point I want to make is that it's a conservative theory. But it has led to liberal findings. We haven't talked much about conservative and liberal. In sociology, you can't get away from those topics. It's a science, but we're dealing with human policies and decisions. And so questions of ideology and who's liberal or conservative always come up in sociology. What do we mean by conservative in this case? Sociologically, we could say somebody's conservative if they basically believe that human nature is evil. Who are conservatives and how do they think? Well, the person who wrote this theory is a guy named Travis Hershey, and he himself is politically conservative. He votes for conservative people like Mitt Romney or Ronald Reagan, that kind of people. And he's deeply religious Catholic. And as you may know, conservatives tend to be much more religious than other people. And the Catholic religion is a conservative religion. If you're Catholic, you know that what it says is we're all sinners. We were born sinners because of what? Because of Adam and Eve. When we were in the Garden of Eden, we weren't sinners. But Eve and Adam, they ate that apple, and now we're all sinners. So you're born a sinner, and you need to be saved. You need to develop a strong relationship with God and the church. You need to be bonded to God and the church, because if you're not bonded to God and the church, then that evil soul you have is going to go out and do evil stuff. That's a very conservative way of thinking about human beings. And it goes back to like Thomas Hobbes, one of the conservative political philosophers, who said, we have to have a king. King is the only thing that'll work, because human beings are naturally evil and mean to each other. And if you don't have one powerful guy in charge, keeping everybody in check, then they're just it's not going to work. Liberal people tend to believe in things like democracy and let everybody have a choice, be involved. So what do liberals think? Liberals tend to think of human nature is either blank, it's a blank slate, meaning you're born either good or evil, it depends how you get raised. Or it's good, in fact, you're born already wanting to treat people with respect and decency and not wanting to hurt people. So liberals tend to think because human beings are naturally either good or neither good nor evil, then we need to create a society that allows them to be good. If you have a capitalist society where everyone's greedy, then people will be led to want to be greedy because they're blank, but they're being rewarded for being greedy. Conservatives tend to say people are born greedy. That's why you need to have a society that throws the really greedy people in jail and keeps the other people working and stuff like that. Whereas a liberal might say, no, people are capable of being quite good to each other, so we should set up society so it allows people to be good to each other and doesn't encourage them to be bad to each other. So that's a basic difference, you could say, between those who believe in conservative views and those who believe in liberal is, what do you think human nature is? Well, this theory seems to say that human nature is evil, that we're born wanting to do bad stuff to each other, like raping and stealing and killing, and the only thing that keeps us from doing that is a strong social bond. If you've got this chain that chains up your evil beast inside you, then you can keep that evil beast from being bad. And that seems to be what the theory says. At least it's based on that assumption. That's why I say the theory itself and the person who wrote it is conservative in their thinking. When I say liberal findings, though, what do I mean? Findings are studies. When you go out and do studies, that's when you test a theory. So this theory says this is how it works. Well, to find out if the theory is right, you got to go out and do studies and collect data and collect a bunch of data on young people and find out who's involved in crime and who isn't. And then find out, do they really have the bond? The ones who aren't involved in crime, could they be shown to be more strongly bonded to their society than the ones who are involved in crime? And these studies have shown just that. Study after study has supported and confirmed control theory and said that really does make an explanation of who are the criminals. It's the ones who aren't bonded. And the ones who aren't criminals are the ones who are bonded. So the findings have supported the theory. But why do I say they're liberal? Liberal findings, what do liberals say about crime in our society? And liberal findings. One thing is that family structure is not significant. Some conservatives would say, and do still say, you got to have a dad. If the kid doesn't have a dad around the house, then the kid's going to be headed for trouble because young boys need to have a dad. And if that boy doesn't have a dad, he's probably going to be a criminal. And so a lot of conservatives will say we can't have single moms raising families because those children don't have the right family structure and they're going to end up bad. Well, the findings of these studies have shown that's not the case. If a kid has a bond to society and if they have attachment to an adult, it doesn't seem to matter whether that attachment is a single mom, a single dad, two gay moms, two gay dads, no parents but some uncle. What matters is the attachment. And again, I can tell you from my own experience, when I went to a wealthy school on the East Coast that had its own police force, some of the kids there were very wealthy. They had two parents, but they had never really had a bond with their parents. This would come out when we were partying sometimes. They'd start crying. And I'm like, why are you so sad? We're partying. You're so lucky you had a dad and mom, they would say to me. And they're like, I went to prep school since I was 6. Like, mom and dad just sent me off to school. And they never really had dad or mom. They had these teachers at the schools that were paid to take care of them, but they never really felt connected or attached to those people. And so they were sort of missing in life this sense of adults who care about me and want to take care of me. And they were wealthy people with 2 married parents. But and some of them were involved in various sorts of deviant criminal activity. By the same token, I'm sure you've met many poor people around this community who might have one mom, but they love her so much and so connected to her, and that mom is so watching over them to help make sure they're on the right path that they are on the right path. So again, it's not a matter of your family structure, and it's the attachment to a law-abiding adult. And it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, black or white, brown or yellow. What matters is the attachment. Same with class and race. Are not significant in the sense of determining who is going to be a lawbreaker. Rich white men can be lawbreakers just as much as poor black men. But what matters is the bond. And you can find lots of poor black men that are well bonded to their society, that go to church, that have long-term goals, that are trying hard to make it in America and follow the rules. And you can find plenty of wealthy white men and means that are not doing that. So what really matters is the bond. Do you care about society's rules and want to follow them and want to be known as somebody who does? Or are you somebody who's just like, screw it, I'll do whatever I want. I don't pay no taxes because I'm smart like that. I don't know. Anyway, so I'm picking on Trump again, but that's my right, I guess. In sociology class, I can get away with talking about politics because, as I just said, it's part of the material of the class. But a lot of true conservatives don't like Trump either because he's not really upholding conservative values like being bonded to your society and wanting to do what's right in the society. But anyway, so control theory, by asking a sort of different question, takes us in a different direction of understanding how people behave when it comes to the rules. And this theory is one of the dominant ones, as your textbook says. If you ask what is the main theory in sociology today about crime and criminals, I think your textbook says control theory is one of the ones that's gotten wide support. And one of the reasons I think it does have wide support is it has something in there for both liberal sociologists who like that it shows what they've been saying for a long time about single moms and class and race. On the other hand, conservatives like it because it emphasizes something they've said for a long time, which is you've got to help people be connected and bonded and control themselves. And that's the key to having a well-ordered, functioning society. So both sides see something to like about it. But a real question we haven't asked yet is, how do you test theories? If you're going to test theories, you got to have data. And with crime data, that's a sketchy question. So we have to talk about crime measurement. Not that easy to measure crime. If I gave you a quick extra credit assignment here, actually if I even said you can get an automatic A for the semester, if you can tell me what percentage of Yuba College students smoke marijuana. If that was your assignment, go out and come back with the answer by Wednesday. Could you do it? Well, one quick way might be, I'll just go to the campus police. We have campus police here. Couldn't I just ask them how many people smoke pot at Yuba College? What data would they have if I said, can you give me your data, your information on who smokes pot? What might they have? People who are arrested. So if I asked the cops, can you please give me the number of people arrested for smoking pot who were Yuba College students last year? Would that give me the count?
It'd be only the people that got caught.
It'd be only the people that got caught, and I have a feeling it might be 0. I don't know if they made any arrests for marijuana last year. Let's say it was 2. What did that tell me? It tells me the cops arrested 2 people for smoking pot. It didn't tell me at all what I'm trying to find out, which is what percentage of Yuba College students smoke pot. So how could you get that data?
Ask doctors in the area? I know that sounds kind of weird, but I mean like physicians in the area?
Go see how many have been admitted to the emergency room for pot overdoses or something?
Well, no, but generally doctors have to have the information whether or not their patients have previously done that.
Right, maybe. Yeah, you could ask. That'd be an interesting one if people admit to smoking pot on their medical records. And what you would be doing in that case is a form of what's called unofficial data. Anyway, basic 2 ways we can do it. We can ask the authorities who enforce the law how many people do something, but we'll only get a partial answer if we do it that way. We can ask people themselves if they do this illegal behavior, and we may only get a partial answer that way. And so we need to figure out how to bring different kinds of data together here to get an accurate answer. And there's 2 main ways to measure crime. There's what are known as official measures, and then there are unofficial measures. The main kind of official measure is what are known as arrest statistics. And that was the first kind you mentioned there. If I went and asked the statistics, maybe you take that class. Anyway, if I went to the police and asked them how many people they arrested for pot, that would give me an arrest statistic. And by the way, that's one of the main ways that crime is measured in the United States. One of the main ways it's done is something called the Uniform Crime Report. That's put out by the FBI. It's sometimes just referred to as the UCR, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI is like the nation's police force. Now, they don't patrol every city, so how do they get information on the cities? Well, what they do is they basically send a survey. They have a long list of every crime they can think of, or every crime that's a crime in America pretty much. And they send that list to all the police stations in America. And they say to all these police stations, please fill out on this list the number of arrests you made last year for each of these crimes. So that researcher at the police department, or somebody whose job it is at the police department, goes over this survey and they look at their own records and they say, well, jaywalking, we had 20 for that. Pot, we had 17. Murder, we had 0. Grand theft, we had 5. And so they just go down the list and put down the number of arrests. The FBI compiles this list. So they have lists from every police department, or many of them, in the country, and they put it all into one uniform crime report. So this is the same list, but it compiles all the numbers, aggregates the numbers from every police department. So that way we get a list of how many people were arrested for every one of these crimes in America. And I think they do it like every 2 years. So it's not every year. The first eight offenses that are listed on this list, offenses is another word for crimes. The first 8 offenses are known as index offenses. Index is a way of measuring. If you want to know, for example, is crime going up or not in America? And that's a big topic right now. The presidential debate got onto that topic. Today's newspaper had a headline about that topic. Americans are always wondering, is crime up or down? And maybe I should ask you that right now. Raise your hand if you think crime is up in America right now. Well, a good question would be compared to what? Is crime up compared to last year in America? Raise your hand if you think it is. Is crime up compared to 10 years in America? Raise your hand if you think it is. You're wrong. Crime is up if you compare it to last year. If you compare it over time, the basic trend is crime is way down in America compared to what it was in 1993. And we're talking about all violent crime and property crime. So it's actually really good news that crime is much lower today in America than it was in the early 90s. In fact, it's now down to levels that we hadn't seen before since the early 1970s. So crime is way down in America. And most Americans, when you ask them, is crime up or down, most Americans, like you did, say, it's up. Now, you were right if you were just talking about compared to last year, because there's been a slight uptick. And that's kind of what they were talking about at the presidential debate. But if you're talking about in general, is crime up or down? In general, it's down. And Americans should know this. But why do you think Americans don't know this?
They just look at what they hear on the news and stuff like that.
The mass media doesn't generally report that crime is down. They like to report that crime is up. I mean, it's not really, their goal is to get you to watch the news. So if somebody gets shot anywhere, then that's going to be the first story they run on the news. The idea is if it bleeds, it leads, meaning if it's a good, bloody story, then we'll put it first. So night after night, if you watch TV news, there's going to be somebody murdered, night after night. And if you watch it every night, you're like, man, there's always murder in America. And there is always murder somewhere. There's always some murder to report. But what they're not reporting on is the murder rate. They're just telling you about a murder happened, a murder happened, a murder happened, a murder happened. They did. But there's much fewer murders now than there used to be, and that should be good news. But the good news doesn't always sell products. Another reason we have news media and media in general is for the commercials. And the commercials want you to be afraid and want you to think you need something like an alarm, a gun, a safer house, a safer car, whatever it is. So they need to scare you to sell products. If they came on and said everything's great in America, news at 11, well, probably you wouldn't watch the news. You'd watch something more entertaining. Because everything's fine, I don't need to worry. And if you weren't worried, you wouldn't need somebody to tell you, hey, you need a claw for your car because someone's going to jack you up. But as long as you're afraid, then you'll want to buy stuff. So the news media and the media in general have much more interest in scaring you than in reassuring you that things are okay in America. But anyway, a lot of us think crime is up when it isn't. But how do we know? And really, the answer is always yes and no. Because there's hundreds of crimes out there. And in any given year, if you ask, is crime up? Well, for some crimes it'll be up. And for some others it'll be down. For others there'll be no change. So really when you ask, is crime up? You have to ask, compared to what? Compared to last year? Which crime are you talking about? Index offenses mean to make this a little easier. The first 8 offenses are serious, violent crimes. I don't have the list memorized, but it's like murder and rape and assault with a deadly weapon and things like that. Why are they the index Because if they told you that jaywalking was up, that jaywalking is up 20% since last year, you might not care that much, because I'm not too worried about jaywalking. Or if they said check kiting is up, you wouldn't care that much about check kiting. But if murder is higher than it was last year, well, that's something people want to know. And, assault and those things. So these are thought to be the ones people care about. They're serious offenses, meaning people are worried about these. And so if these are up, then that's a good indication that crime in general is up. There might be some crimes that aren't. But if these are up, or most of these 8 are up, then we can generally say crime is up. If most of these are down, or all of them are down, we can generally say crime is down. But when it comes to measuring anything, we need to worry about reliability and validity. Anytime you're measuring anything, those are two issues that are going to arise. Like if you want to know how much you weigh, and lately I've been going to the gym, so I have a keen interest in how much I weigh. Well, how do I know how much I weigh? I got to get on the scale. And how do you know if your scale is telling you the truth? Well, reliability is consistency. If you get on a scale and it tells you you're 100 pounds, and you go, yeah, I only weigh 100, and then you get on it again and it says you're 300, and you go, wait a second, something's wrong here. And then I get on and it says I'm 208. Well, there's things all over the place. So it's not reliable. I can't trust any of the weights it gave me. I once went to a doctor to get a checkup, and his scale said I was 185. And I said, Doc, there's something wrong with your scale. I'm not 185. I'm at least 205. This was back then. And he said, yes, this is a little something I do for my female patients. He was a Russian guy. I said, what do you do? He says, I calibrate my scale, 20 pounds light. I said, why? He said, because I don't need to know your exact weight. That's not medically important to me. I just need a baseline. I just need to know how much you weigh this time so I can compare it to next time and know if you went up or down. So no, my scale is not accurate. It's not a valid scale. I wasn't really 205. I wasn't really 185. But it was a reliable scale. It was consistent. So he knew that if I weighed, 189 next time, that he could rely on it that I actually did gain 4 pounds of weight. But it wasn't accurate. He didn't know my exact weight looking at it, unless he did the math and said, okay, subtract 20 pounds. But the point is when it comes to measuring crime, we want it to be consistent. We don't want it to go up and down all over the place. We want it to be consistent in what it's measuring. And we would hope it's accurate. And arrest statistics, you can say, are neither one. They're not reliable, nor are they valid. Why is that? Well, arrest statistics can go up and down for reasons that have nothing to do with whether crime itself is going up or down. If the cops decide, or for example, sometimes cops have to do what the mayor tells them. If a new mayor gets elected and this mayor says, I'm the new mayor of Marysville and we're cracking down on pot. Marysville's not going to be a pot town anymore. And he tells his police force, I want you to arrest people for pot. You need to really enforce the pot laws around here. Well, you're going to see a lot more arrests for pot for a while. That doesn't necessarily mean more people are smoking or selling. It just means the cops are arresting more. And so it's not a valid measure. It's not a reliable measure of crime. It's a reliable measure of what the cops are doing. They're arresting people. A few years ago, there was a little ad in the little story in the paper that said the cops in Marysville are going to be patrolling Northfield Road. They're going to set up a speed trap because they don't, or a speed checkpoint, they said. And I read it, and I'm like, okay, I better not speed on Northfield Road. Northfield Road, by the way, is the most dangerous in the county. Most deaths on that road. And I read that, and then I got caught speeding, and I got a ticket. And if you looked at the arrest statistics for the Marysville police that week, and you looked at arrests for speeding or citations for speeding, you would have seen a big spike, a lot more arrests for speeding. Did that mean speeding actually went up? No, speeding probably went down. A lot of people read the article and decided not to speed. I was stupid, I didn't. So speeding actually went down, but the arrests went up. So it's not reliable. If you look at the arrest going up for something or down, that doesn't tell you that the crime itself was going up or down. It tells you something else maybe. So they're not very reliable. They're also not valid for the reasons we just said, like well, we didn't really say it, but if you were trying to figure out how much pot smoking was going on at Yuba College. The number of people arrested for it doesn't tell you that. That's not a measure of how many people smoke pot. It's a measure of how many people were arrested for it. Arrests do not equal crimes. That's a principle we're saying here. Just because somebody's arrested didn't mean they did it. That's one point. And just because somebody wasn't arrested doesn't mean they didn't do it. So arrests aren't telling us how much crime's out there. They're just telling us what the cops are doing. And that's why it's called an official measure. It's measuring what the cops are doing. It's a measure of official activity. The cops are arresting people, and we can get a figure of how many they're arresting for what. Now, court statistics are like that too. Those are another kind of official measure that measures how many cases are being processed through the courts, because obviously not everyone arrested gets processed through the courts. But if you want to know like how much murder is happening in America, looking at how many cases of murder have been cleared through the courts gives you some kind of figure. Now, I just told you that arrest statistics are neither reliable nor valid, and that's true. But when it comes to serious, violent crimes, they don't tend to not lead to arrest. In other words, if somebody ends up dead, murdered, then people get arrested. They might not be the right people. They might be many more people than did it. So it's not an accurate picture of how many people did the crime. But it's reliable in the sense that if arrests for murder go up, then we can pretty much guess that the cops aren't just randomly arresting people for murder, that a murder happened. They might be wrong about who and have the wrong people, but they're arresting people for murder, so it's a sign that murder has gone up. And for these serious violence offenses, arrest statistics remain some of the best ways of measuring whether that's going up or down in society. On the other hand, for other kinds of crimes, like pot smoking, arrests are really bad measure of that, because most people who smoke pot never get arrested for it. Most people who jaywalk never got arrested for that. Most people who vandalize something never got arrested for that. So there's a lot of crime out there that the cops don't really spend a lot of time arresting people for. For those, you need what are called self-report studies. You need people themselves to report on their criminal behavior. So doctors ask that. Doctors ask, do you smoke pot? Do you use illegal drugs? And if people say they do on there, that's probably a pretty reliable indication that they do, if you could get those medical records, which you could not, because they're private. And it would take a lot of legal maneuvering to get those medical records from doctors. So it might be nice. And sometimes sociologists do get access to various kinds of medical data. But personal records of people saying they smoke pot, a doctor would lose his license if he was giving out that information. So, but how can you get that data? How can you get people to report on their own crime? You can do self-report studies, which are basically surveys. And if you wanted to know at Yuba College what percentage smoke pot here, you would pretty much have to give a survey. You'd have to get a sample of Yuba College students, have them fill it out, and try to determine what percentage of your respondents to the survey smoke pot, and from there estimate the number of Yuba College students that smoke marijuana. One of the most commonly used ones is the Monitoring the Future study. That's an example of a self-report study. Now, the Monitoring the Future is a survey of high school students. They have a very large N. We haven't talked about N's yet, but N in this case refers to the number of people that are surveyed in the study. And this one has a very large N. It has an N of 100,000 people filling out the survey. Most surveys are much smaller than that. Like when you read in the paper right now that Hillary Clinton has a certain percentage of support and Trump has a certain percentage of support, those are based on surveys of the American population. Do you know how many Americans you have to survey to get an accurate picture of there's about 350 million Americans. So I don't know how many of those are registered voters, but how many do you think you need to survey? If you were going to do a survey, how many people do you need to give the survey to figure out what 350 million Americans think? Because when I say N, we're talking about a sample. And in sociological research, you rarely can study the whole group you're interested in. You have to get a little sample of them. So we're talking about a sample here. And sample size matters for what I'm talking about. But how many do you think you need? For a big national survey on presidential polls, the usual N is like 1,500. 1,500 people is all the newspaper needs, or ABC News needs, or whoever did the poll. They need 1,500 people. They survey them. They get the sample from around the country, so they're representing the whole country, and they do it randomly, so it's a random sample. But they only need 1,500 because statistics is kind of magical that way. If you can get an accurate read on 1,500, you can get an accurate read on 350 million Americans within a certain, margin of error. But 100,000, that's a huge sample, and it's called an oversample. Why do they do that? Because they want to do comparisons like between Latino working class men versus African American middle class women. I mean, if you're going to compare such fine-grained groups, you need enough people in each category to be able to do a meaningful statistical analysis, and so you need a big sample. So they have a big sample. And what I'm trying to get at here is reliability and validity. What do you think might be the problem with surveying people? If you're asking people about pot smoking, the cops didn't arrest enough people or the right people, so that's not an accurate picture. So you do a survey of Yuba College and ask them if they smoke pot. What might be your problems with your reliability of your data there? What did he say? I don't want John to answer all the questions. He seems to already know the answers to all my questions. Maybe he should teach it. No, actually, no. I mean, he's a smart guy. He knows his sociology, but you might think people lie. You might think people, if asked about their illegal activity, would not tell the truth. And if they're not telling the truth, then we can't rely on the data. But that's not the problem. They do tell the truth. The surveys are anonymous. They're confidential. Most people, when filling them out, don't do a lot of lying. And even if they do, people's lies cancel each other out. Because some people might say, I never smoke pot. And they're high right now while they're filling out the survey. And some people might say, I smoke 3 blunts a day. And then you're like, what's a blunt? And they go, I don't know. I just heard cool kids do that. So they lie both ways, but you still got an accurate picture. One smokes pot and one doesn't. But the point is it's not the lying that's the issue. We'll come back. The issue is sampling. And we'll talk about it on Wednesday.